ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hello and welcome to Conversations. Conversations is now 20 years old. And so throughout August, we're bringing you some of our favourites from the archives. And today is one from the shelves right back at the start of the cupboard with science writer Rebecca Skloot, who told us the story of Henrietta Lacks, or as she's known to scientists, HeLa, the first human being to touch immortality. And she never even knew it. Over this hour, we're going to bring you a story that I think really is one of the strangest and most moving science stories of the 20th century. It started way back in the year 1951, when a young African-American woman called Henrietta Lacks went to see the doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the city of Baltimore. Henrietta said to the doctor that there was something inside her that felt like a kind of a knot. What followed from that slightly alarming doctor's visit changed what we know of the human body. And I can make the claim that your life has almost certainly been affected by what happened on that day, in one way or another. And here's the thing. So few people know this story. It's likely that you've never even heard of Henrietta Lacks before. And that's surprising because this woman is the first human being that we know of to seriously touch immortality. Ironically, Henrietta Lacks never lived to see it actually happen. After she died, her immortal cells were mass-produced in vast numbers and used to conquer all sorts of diseases. Parts of her went into space and were sent to nuclear test sites. The story shows how science can transform the lives of millions of people, you and I, for the better. But it also reveals how clumsy and heartless individual scientists can be in their pursuit of a scientific dream. This all sounds a little enigmatic, I know, but the best person to explain the story of Henrietta Lacks is Rebecca Skloot, and Rebecca is my guest on Conversations today. Rebecca Skloot is a science writer, and she's contributed to the New York Times Magazine and to several science journals in the United States. Rebecca Skloot spent years with the family and descendants of Henrietta Lacks, and it's because of her doggedness and her compassion that the full story has come to light. Rebecca Skloot, welcome to Conversations.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I first heard this story about a week ago, listening to Radiolab, a show you contribute to sometimes. And when I heard it, I got excited. I went home, told my wife about this, made her listen to it, came into the office, told everyone in the office about it, and looked across the vast pile of books that are right next to my desk, and there was your book. Now, that was a kind of a coincidence, but Henrietta's family wouldn't see that as any kind of coincidence, would they?
No, not at all. And at this point, probably neither would I. But yes, that was obviously Henrietta had placed that book there and made it so that you heard the Radiolab story to pique your interest.
Well, her family were telling you that all the time, weren't they, when you found things?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Henrietta died in the 50s. She left 5 children behind, and they didn't know anything about these cells having grown until about 25 years later. You know, her husband had a 3rd grade education. He didn't even know what a cell was. And he got this phone call one day saying what he thought to be, "We've got your wife. She's alive in the laboratory. We've been doing research on her for the last 25 years, and now we have to test your children to see if they have cancer." None of which was what they said at all. But, you know, they didn't know what a cell was. He thought they had her in a prison cell. That was the only kind of cell he'd ever heard of. And so the family very much believed that her soul was alive in these cells. They would often ask scientists, you know, what does it mean that these cells are alive all these years after she died? And can she rest in peace if you're, you know, shooting these bits of her up to the moon and injecting them with chemicals? So they've always believed that Henrietta and the cells are one, and that these cells are essentially an extension of her living on, and that she actually does control things, including me. It took me about 1.5 years to convince them to talk to me and sort of win their trust, but eventually they believed that I had been sort of chosen to tell this story, and that Henrietta had sort of been working me as a puppet my whole life. You know, go over here and study science, go over here and study writing, and also that I could write this book eventually.
Rebecca, I think it's interesting you sort of said that you're not quite sure if you think that's true or not at this point, but I want to come to that a little bit later. The story sort of, you can start at any point really, but let's start at that doctor's visit in 1951 when she came to the doctor feeling unwell, talking about a knot. They obviously found a tumour. How did the examining doctor describe this tumour?
It was about the size of a nickel, and it was very unusual looking. It was purple and raised and sort of glistening. He described it as looking like grape jello. And to this day, I mean, he remembers that tumor very clearly because he just never saw anything like it in his whole career.
No, she'd actually given birth 3 months before this diagnosis.
Right.
They hadn't noticed the tumour then?
No, they hadn't. And whether that's just because they didn't notice it or because it wasn't there, no one will ever know. There's a chance, I mean, given how fast the cancer grew and spread, there's absolutely a chance that it wasn't there 3 months earlier and that it appeared that quickly. There's also a chance that they just didn't see it when she was giving birth.
Parts of that carcinoma were removed for research purposes. Why were they taken away for research purposes? What was going on?
Well, Henrietta went into the hospital it happened to be at this incredibly important time in the history of cervical cancer research. The Pap smear had just recently been developed, and the doctors at Johns Hopkins were taking samples from any woman who came in with cervical cancer with hopes of growing those samples in a petri dish so that they could look at the cells under a microscope and see what they actually looked like. Because they had the Pap smear, but they didn't really know how to use it. So they were basically trying to identify what they were looking for with the Pap smear. And at the same time, George Guy, who is the scientist who actually grew the cells, he had been trying to just grow any cells outside the body. There was this effort worldwide going on to grow human cells so that they could be used in the laboratory in place of animals for research and in place to do some studies that you couldn't really do on living humans. So there were a lot of reasons why her cells were taken. And George Guy had been trying for decades to grow human cells, and they just always died.
Always. It always
yeah.
failed. What happened when her cells were brought to the lab? You spoke to the research assistant. How did she describe her own kind of blasé reaction to another bunch of cells?
She was actually eating her lunch when the cells came in, and she has this very clear memory of sitting there, and George Guy came in with yet another dish of cells for her to cut. So she would take the tumor and cut it into little bits and put it in different test tubes and try and grow it. And she just sort of rolled her eyes and she was like, "Oh, great, another batch of cells that are all going to die. I'm just going to finish my lunch." And every moment that the cells sat there on the counter, they got closer to death. So for her to actually even put off doing something with the cells made it more likely that they would have died.
What did she notice about these cells?
Well, initially nothing. They just looked like every other cells, and she put them in the dishes, and then she went home for the day. And then when she came back into the lab, there was this little white ring around the bits of tissue in each of the dishes, and it looked like, she's described it as looking like fried egg yolk. And then almost immediately the cells just took off. They doubled their numbers every 24 hours. So they very quickly filled each tube that they were in, and then they divided those into 2 and then 4 and then 8 and then 16. And they just took over the lab pretty quickly. And they did the same thing in Henrietta's body. I mean, her cancer, there was something about her cancer that was incredibly powerful. And that nickel-sized tumor, within just a few months, took over almost every organ in her body.
This is the I suppose in some ways the strangest part of the story. Are you saying then that her cells, these cancer cells, were effectively immortal?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's immortality. There's actually a scientific term, immortality, when it applies to cells. So an immortal cell line, the definition of that is a line of cells that all descended from one sample that will just never die. They will continue to grow and divide, and there will always be cells that descended from that first sample. And that's the case with hers, absolutely.
And her cells,
you can kill them, but if you feed them and keep them warm, they'll stay alive forever.
So these cells, these cancer cells, then are filling test tube after test tube. How shocked were the scientists by this?
Well, initially, George Guy actually didn't believe that they were immortal, in part, I think, because he just didn't want to get his hopes up, because he'd been trying to do this for so many decades. But then when it became clear that these were actually not going to die, he was ecstatic. They all were. And George Guy began telling friends of his in other labs, I think I have the first immortal human cell line. And they all said, great, can we have some? And so he just sent them to anybody who would use them in research. He would, today you can go online and you order a vial of cells and they'll FedEx them to you. And, it's a very quick process. But then you couldn't just send cells by mail. So he would actually take tubes of cells to the airport and go to pilots and flight attendants and say, hey, will you stick this in your pocket and take it to, Minneapolis or India or wherever it needed to go? And they would do that to keep the cells warm, and they would fly wherever they needed to go. And then on the other end, there'd be a scientist standing there waiting for the cells, and they'd grab the tubes and run back to their offices and grow them. And the excitement around this was just incredible. The number of scientists around the world who'd been waiting for something like this for years was pretty amazing.
The cells were called HeLa, short for, of course, Henrietta Lacks, but that doesn't really point to her identity specifically. And as you say, she died at this point from the cancer. What did they performed an autopsy on her? What did the autopsy reveal about that cancer?
Yeah, the autopsy revealed that the cancer had spread to almost every organ in her body. She was 30 years old, and one of the George Guy's assistant, Mary, who was there in the room, described it as looking as if someone had poured a bucket of pearls inside of her, that she was just filled with these white tumors.
Before she died, did she have any knowledge that her cancer cells were being used for research purposes?
No, not at all. She was under anesthesia when they took the cells, so she didn't know that they had taken them in the first place. There's a bit of a debate about whether George Guy ever said anything to her. Everyone that I talked to who knew him and who was around at the time said he never had any contact with her, and he didn't even know anything about her. But one woman who worked in his lab with him said, oh yeah, he told me that not long before she died, he went to her bedside and said, your cells will make you immortal. They will live on and help millions of people. And that Henrietta said that that was good, that she was happy to hear that. Whether that's true, I was never able to verify it beyond that one person.
Doesn't ring true. Sounds like a scene from a movie, doesn't it, Rebecca?
It sounds a little too good to be true, but it also, even if it had happened, I mean, it does, in some ways, it doesn't really match up to what I know about George Guy's personality, really. I mean, he was a very down-to-earth sort of fact-driven guy. I don't think he would have made that kind of a proclamation at that point. But also that even if he had, she wouldn't have understood it. She was on so many different, heavy-duty morphine and all sorts of other pain drugs. She wouldn't have understood what he said, even if she had known what a cell was and what immortality was. I mean, it would have been beyond her, even if he did say something.
Now, as you said, this was a really timely moment for scientists to discover immortal cells, the HeLa cells as they were called, because there was a polio epidemic happening through the United States and indeed through the world at that time. There was a march for polio cure in New York City at that time, Rebecca.
Yeah, and the year she died was the deadliest in the history of the polio epidemic, and it was just getting progressively worse. Every year, more and more people were dying. And Jonas Salk had just created the vaccine for polio, but he couldn't use it because it hadn't been tested. It hadn't been proven effective or safe. And at the time, one of the only ways that they could test to prove a vaccine was effective was to use cells that they could infect with polio. And they were using monkey cells at the time. But because they couldn't grow them indefinitely in culture, they would have to actually harvest these cells from monkeys fresh every time they needed to use them. And the volume of cells that they would have needed to prove that the polio vaccine was effective would have cost, millions and millions of monkeys' lives. And what they were more concerned about was millions and millions of dollars. It was just sort of an inconceivable task. So they were on this quest to find some way to have cells growing that wouldn't involve having to basically kill monkeys every time they needed them. And Henrietta's cells just appeared at that moment when they needed them the most.
How did they bring them into mass production?
They set up a factory, a cell factory, and as soon as the March of Dimes realized that her cells would, in fact, work for the testing the polio vaccine, they set up this factory at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and they had these enormous steel vats of culture medium, which is the liquid that you grow them in, and big assembly lines of test tube vials, and about 7 technicians who worked the lab, all of them black. This was an all-black university. And they just did an assembly line production, and they grew the cells to the tune of about 6 trillion cells a week and sent those out to laboratories around the world. So the volume of cells that they grew was pretty incredible.
6 trillion cells?
A week.
A week?
Yeah.
That then meant that the polio vaccine could be quickly created and then quickly disseminated. And bang, that's the end of polio, Rebecca.
Right. It was, and the polio vaccine was being created in other ways. It was really the testing that was done with those cells, and all of those, the 6 trillion cells every week were going out to these polio testing centers, and the field trials for testing polio vaccine were the biggest in history. Millions of kids got these vaccines, and so they did that. But then at the same time, they were able to grow so many cells that they were also sending them out for lots of other research. And the explosion of science that happened in 1954 to 56 using her cells was very challenging in a sense to document in the book, because it was like there was no science for a long time using cells, and then all of a sudden it was like this unbelievable explosion of discoveries related to cells, all using her cells. The first cells ever cloned.
You write in your book, HeLa cells were used for the study of herpes, for leukemia, Parkinson's disease, HIV/AIDS. They were even sent into space. Why were HeLa cells sent into space, Rebecca?
The HeLa cells in space is one of my favorite of the research stories, in part because I love just that phrase, HeLa in space. But they also, what's interesting is this was the very beginning of the space missions. So the idea was if you could send these human cells up in space, you could see what happened to them in zero gravity. And one of the things that they found was that every time they sent HeLa cells up, they grew faster. And so they thought, wow, if an astronaut has cancer, every time we send this person up, is his cancer going to grow faster and faster and faster and become this sort of mutant cancer? But what I think is most interesting is that the whole thing was actually a cover for a spying mission. So they went up in these satellites that were actually going up to photograph Russia. And they called this a biological payload. So the HeLa cell research was legitimate research, but it was actually just covering up spying.
Do you have a figure, Rebecca, on how many of her cells were grown?
Yeah, there have been several efforts to figure that out. One scientist calculated that if you could have saved all of the cells that grew from that first sample and put them on a scale, that by now they would weigh more than 50 million metric tons, which is more than 150 Empire State Buildings. And cells weigh almost nothing on their own, so it's hard to even wrap your mind around how many cells that actually is.
How many Empire State Buildings did you say?
150. More than 150. So
cell research exploded, as you say, after this, and scientists suddenly discovered that, wow, normal human cells eventually, if you have them in cell culture, they turn into cancer cells. Right. Wrong. What had happened there?
They called this the HeLa bomb. Because, in the early days, right after HeLa cells grew, the scientists started taking samples from anyone they could get their hands on, themselves, their kids, their patients, trying to grow a library of human tissues from different sources. They thought if we could grow, breast cells and prostate cells and brain cells, and then we can use them to study all these different organs and different diseases. And they used the same techniques that George Guy used to grow HeLa, and growing cells was just sort of miraculously easy suddenly. And their cells would grow, and then often within, a few weeks or so, they would suddenly become cancerous and take off and grow similarly to HeLa cells. And scientists thought that they had identified the moment that cancer happens. And
My God, the cure for cancer. I know,
right.
It's right within our grasp now, the cure for cancer.
So millions of dollars in research was being poured into cell culture. Nixon launched his war on cancer, which was this multi-million-dollar effort where they were going to find the cure. And then suddenly, in the late 60s, this one young scientist realized what had happened. He was doing some early genetic tests and looking at gene markers in cells, and he was looking at a prostate cancer cell from a white guy. And he noticed that the prostate cancer cell had 2 X chromosomes, which isn't possible because women have 2 X chromosomes and men have an X and a Y, so you can't have a prostate cancer cells. So he then started looking at other markers, and he saw that this cell had this very rare enzyme marker that's really only found in black people. And this was supposed to be from a white guy, so he thought, well, that's weird. This white guy's prostate seems to be from a black woman. And then he started looking at all the other samples that he could get his hands on, and they all had those same 2 markers. So he realized pretty quickly what had happened, and he just stood up at a conference one day and said, all those cells we've been working with, those are actually all HeLa. And it was a huge controversy. I mean, millions of dollars
Your
of
research is now worthless. And how did that go over with those scientists, Rebecca?
Not very well. One of my favorite quotes in the book is a scientist described it as this guy coming along and dropping a turd in the punch bowl. It had been this enormous, cell culture was going to save the world, and it was and then suddenly they just went, oh. So a lot of people denied that it had happened at all, saying, that would be sloppy technique. I would never do such a thing. What actually had happened was that HeLa cells had just contaminated all of the other cell lines. So it turns out that, cells can float on dust particles in the air. If you touch a dish of HeLa cells with your hands and then go touch another dish, you can transfer them from one to the so HeLa cells grow so much more powerfully.
Can we just back up a second?
Sure.
HeLa cells were going from one cell culture in the lab, getting a lift on a dust mote.
Or someone's sleeves,
and going on a magic carpet ride, upstairs, round down a corridor, round in through the door, landing on someone else's petri dish and saying, "We're moving in, you're all going to have to move out." That's what the HeLa cells were doing?
Yes, that's exactly what HeLa cells were doing. And in some cases, it was a more direct transfer. They would use pipettes to, these devices that suck cells out of a dish, and then they would go reuse those in another dish, and they would just be filled with HeLa cells, and they didn't realize it. And one scientist actually, to prove the fact that they were doing this, he had a vial of HeLa cells, and he put it, on one side of the room, and then on the other side of the room, he had a bunch of empty culture dishes, and he just stirred that vial on the one side of the room and then left. And never touched the other dishes, and then came back, and HeLa cells were growing in these other dishes. So so they could travel around, basically. And so this is actually what led to the family finding out finally that Henrietta's cells were still alive, because this was the early days of gene mapping. One scientist figured out, well, if we can get a hold of her kids and get some samples from her kids, we can treat this like a crime scene and use DNA from her kids to, essentially compare them to all these cells. And if they are, in fact, HeLa, they'll match her kids. And that's when they got that sort of fated phone call 25 years after her death, which they thought was saying that she was alive and that they were being tested to see if they were going to die, which wasn't, in fact, what they said at all.
Rebecca Skloot is here in conversation with me. She's the author of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So around about the time of this phone call to the family, scientists began to ask a really important and obvious question. Who was Henrietta Lacks? What can you tell me about Henrietta Lacks, the kind of person she was and where she grew up?
Well, she was a tobacco farmer, so she grew up farming the same land that her ancestors had worked as slaves. And she lived in an old slave shack that is still barely standing today, but, it was just a log cabin. And, she had her children on the dirt floor there, and she had her first child at 14 with her cousin she had been raised with him as a sort of sibling. They shared a bedroom their whole lives. She and her husband moved up to Baltimore in the 40s because they couldn't make a living on their farm, and there was this migration from the South of a lot of black farmers who went to the steel mills when war broke out, and there was this great demand for steel. So they had moved north, sort of the promised land. And she was this incredibly caring woman. A lot of her cousins and relatives and various people from the South would come up to Baltimore after her. And basically, if you came to town and you needed a place to stay while you got settled and, made some money before you could afford your own place, you just stayed on her floor. So at any given time, there could be up to a dozen cousins just sort of camped out on the floor. I talked to one guy who had his own mattress in the hall right outside her bathroom for almost a year. And if you were hungry and you didn't have any food, you went to her house because she always had something on the stove cooking. And if you needed a girlfriend, she'd find you one. I mean, she just took care of everybody. And for her family, eventually they kind of came to feel like this was part of the cells being an extension of her, that the cells are taking care of everyone too, and that they have her personality in that way, and that's their usefulness in science is part of her desire to help people.
I suppose there is the temptation to project the qualities of these cells back onto Henrietta, but it's hard to avoid that conclusion, Rebecca.
Yeah.
The way you're describing her, growing up in these old slave quarters in Virginia and having 5 kids before she died at the age of 30. I'm looking at a photo of her on the cover of your book, and she's beautiful and really sharply dressed, and she's obviously taken great care about her appearance.
Yeah, she did, which was something that everyone who knew her commented on when I talked to them about her. She she didn't have any money, and she had, one nice dress suit. She had 2 silk slips, and she washed those things by hand every night and hung them up so she could wear them. She meticulously painted her fingernails and her toenails and did her hair. She paid a lot of attention to her appearance, and she was beautiful. So she wasn't a woman who looked like she was in the kind of need that she actually was in. And I think that was actually important to her. And it's interesting that the toenail polish is something that comes up again and again in her story. And there's this moment during the autopsy where the laboratory assistant who grew the cells is down there collecting more samples, and she catches a glance of Henrietta's toenails, and they're all chipped, but you can see the red polish still on them. And that was the first moment that this woman ever thought about the fact that the cells actually came from a human being. She said, I looked down at those toenails and I thought, oh no, she actually painted those toes in her bathroom somewhere probably. And that was the first moment that the cells were sort of humanized for her at all. And that comes back again and again through her story.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
When did you first hear about HeLa, Rebecca?
I first learned about the cells when I was 16 in a basic biology class. My teacher said what most biology teachers say at some point in a biology lesson, which is there are these incredible cells. They've been alive since 1951, even though the woman they came from has died that same year. They were one of the most important things that happened in medicine, and he sort of listed off a few of the things that the cells did. And then what was unusual is that he knew her name. So he wrote Henrietta Lacks in big letters on the board and then turned around and said she was a Black woman. And that was it. And class was over. And I went up to him after class and I said, well, what else do we know about her? Who was she? And, why these cells? And what did her family think of this? And he just said, sorry, we don't know anything. And it just stuck. And I just became obsessed with them at that point and really never let it go. I studied the cells before I tried to find anything out much about her. And then I started just my actual first research of trying to actually find her family was just like, phone books and going online and looking for them. And it became clear very quickly that they didn't want to be found. I mean, they were very well hidden. And eventually I found a scientist who had created this conference, a yearly conference in Henrietta's name. And he, it turned out, had contact with the family. And I asked him to put me in touch with them. And he proceeded to grill me for about 4-5 days straight over the phone about basically my intentions and whether he should put me in touch with them. And eventually he deemed me worthy and did give me Deborah's phone number.
He did grill you, as you say, and he asked you what you knew about African Americans and medical research, the history of that in the United States. It turns out you did know something about that, and this is kind of important to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. He was African American, and he was one of George Guy's only African American students, and that's how he sort of was involved with the story. And, one of the first questions he asked me, after saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are white, aren't you? He just said that my race was going to be a big hurdle, and he wanted to know what I knew about what African Americans had been through with science. And there's a long history of African Americans being used in research without their consent. The Tuskegee syphilis studies is one of the most well-known cases where hundreds of Black men were essentially studied to watch how syphilis killed you from infection to death without being offered treatment when it was available.
What did that gynecologist, Roland Patillo, advise you in dealing with the Lacks family, the children of Henrietta Lacks?
He said, be honest, don't hide anything from them. And he said, more than anything, you're going to have to be patient, more than you can imagine. And he was right. My first phone call with Deborah was this incredible sort of manic 45-minute long conversation where she answered the phone and I said I was interested in writing a book about her mother, and she just started talking in this stream of consciousness, mentioning little things here and there that I didn't really understand. Somebody killed somebody and somebody stole her mother's medical records, and then all of a sudden she panicked and she said she worried that Johns Hopkins had maybe sent me to steal her cells and she didn't know who to trust, and then she hung up on me. And that was the moment I realized there was something much more to the story than just the story of Henrietta and her cells.
What happened to Deborah and her brothers and sisters, I should say, after their mother Henrietta had died?
Well, immediately after she died, they were left with their father, who worked full-time, 2 different jobs trying to support the kids. And there was this stream of cousins who would come in and take care of the kids, and some of them were incredibly abusive to the children, to the point of one of them, the youngest son, was left tied up in the basement for long periods of time, whipped, and Deborah was molested by one of them. And their lives after Henrietta's death were horrible, and always colored by the fact that if Henrietta had just been alive, she wouldn't have let any of this happen. So 25 years later, when they got this phone call saying her cells were alive, it was sort of a dream come true, but at the same time, it was sort of terrifying. And they wanted to know, well, was this research hurting her in some way in the afterlife? And that started a long sort of saga for the family, particularly Deborah, who was the most really damaged by the loss of her mother and then the discovery of these cells.
Did they see those cells, the HeLa cells, as her, containing her soul, if you like?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the points in the story where scientists and the Lacks family really diverge. You know, scientists will say, well, but what? They're just some of her cells. She can't feel this. But for the family, her DNA is in there, and it is a part of her. And not only that, it's a part of her womb. It's the part of the same place in her body where they came from. And yeah, they absolutely believed that her soul was alive in there, and that she had essentially been brought back to life as an angel to take care of people.
To a small degree, do you think they might be right in a sense that it is a part of her and thriving and propagating, and it contains all the genetic information of Henrietta? In some ways, it kind of is her. It's not guided by a mind, but it is her to some degree, isn't it, Rebecca?
Yeah, it's hard to argue against that. And a lot of that depends on how you define life and how you define a soul and how you define a self. And scientists tend to go with the harder fact. You know, we know that there is no thinking in there. There's no neurons. There's no nerves. She can't feel things. But yeah, absolutely. It very much depends on how you define those things. And, you know, her DNA is in there. You can look at her DNA, even though it's sort of mutated after all these years of growing in culture. You can learn things about her and her kids. And, you know, the only other example of a little bit of you that can live on like that with your DNA in it after your death is your children, basically.
This is when we get to the point where research scientists and I suppose journalists to some degree can be kind of emotionally tone deaf, Rebecca, when they're in the pursuit of the greater good, saving millions of lives. And here's a shocking case of this. You write in your book that when they realised that so many cell cultures have been contaminated, if that's the word, or mastered by Henrietta's cells, the HeLa cells, they needed to get DNA samples from the surviving children. They sent a research scientist who was a Chinese-American woman with a slightly, imperfect, but a slightly broken grasp of English. How did that conversation go with the Lacks family?
Yes, to say that it was slightly difficult was, yes, is a kind way to put it. She was Chinese. She had only been in the United States for a very short while. She was a graduate student who'd come to study at Hopkins, and the scientist whose lab she worked in, very famous geneticist, often held up as the grandfather of the Human Genome Project. He did incredibly important genetic research. He said, go get some samples from this family. He didn't tell her how to explain these cells' existence, or even that the family didn't know. And so she called, and in English that was very hard for me to understand 25 years later when I talked to her, said that the cells were alive and that she needed samples from them. And she said, we need to look at your HeLa markers to see if there's, the antigens or the matching with the HeLa, and things that they just could not have understood, even if she had been speaking perfect English. So it really was a sort of, there was a communication breakdown. It was a sort of clash of cultures. She couldn't understand them either. I mean, Henrietta's husband speaks with a very thick Southern accent. His children often teased him and called it his country mumble. He just sort of talked like this. So she couldn't have understood him. He couldn't understand her. And no one stopped to say, wait a minute, we should make sure everyone actually knows what's going on here.
They didn't even know what a cell was. And you said they thought that in the DNA test they were actually being tested for cancer, and they spent months waiting for results.
Yeah, this was one of the first very traumatic things that happened, particularly for Deborah. She grew up knowing that her mother died at 30. She didn't really know why, and she had lived her life in fear of her own 30th birthday, thinking that the same would happen to her. She was in her late 20s when the doctors called, so for her and for the rest of her family, it seemed like the appropriate timing, and she thought, oh, my worst fears are coming true. They're coming now when I'm about my mother's age to test me to see if I'm going to die like she did. So they took the samples from the kids and then went away, and the family just waited for the results, which never came. And they would occasionally call the switchboard at Hopkins and say, we're calling for our test results. And the operator would just say, I'm sorry, I don't have any record of you as a patient. I don't know what tests you're talking about. And then periodically the scientists would come back and take more samples. And the family thought all along that it was them that was being tested.
There's a Dr. McCusick who was sort of in charge of this process of checking the DNA of the family. And they were brought into the presence of this great man, the family, and Dr. McCusick told Deborah about her mother's cells being blown up by atomic bombs, which they were, to test the effect of radiation on human cells, and going up on space missions. What did Deborah hear when Dr. McCusick told her this?
Yeah, this was another moment of sort of communication misfire. He thought she wanted to know about the cells, so he told her about this research. And to her, all she heard was, they're blowing up my mother. They're sending my mother to the moon. Over and over again, later they created the first cells that were essentially a fusion of mouse cells and human cells, these hybrids, mouse-human hybrids, and they made those with HeLa cells. And when Deborah heard about that, all she heard was, they created something that's half my mother and half mouse. They did the same thing with a tobacco plant, And so for her, these were just all terrifying. And she really worried that it was somehow causing damage to her mother. When she found out that the cells were cloned, she very much believed her mother had been cloned. And so she was terrified of going to any major city in the United States up until when I met her, and I was never able to really convince her that this wasn't the case. She wouldn't go to any city because she thought that if she got off of a train or a plane, she would see her mother everywhere, these clones of her mother walking down the street, and that her mother wouldn't know that she was her daughter, and that it would be this very terrifying experience. And I would explain to her, no, it's the cells that have been cloned, not her. And she would just sort of say, yeah, right. I've seen the movies. If you Google Henrietta Lacks and clone, you get thousands and thousands of hits. So she thought, well, there's thousands and thousands of clones.
The Lacks family are from the Bible Belt, and they're deeply Christian people. They had no education to speak of beyond, not even really up to high school, did they? So they didn't really know anything about cells or the science, but they did know something about voodoo. To some extent, did they see this as witchcraft?
Some members of her family definitely did. There was one of her cousins who very much believed that he told me, some diseases are man-made, and some diseases are like God-made or spirit-made. And, he very much believed that this was an act of voodoo that had created this cancer. And he would say, how else do you explain how these cells are growing like this all these years after she died? And that's something that the family struggled with on many levels. He was the only one who had that really deep sort of voodoo belief, but there were different levels of that throughout the family, and a lot of them felt like the cells are a miracle, that they really are essentially Henrietta reincarnated. If you read the Bible, it says very clearly, believers will be granted immortal life, and you never know what form they're going to come back in. So for a lot of members of her family, you look at the cells and you say, okay, so this is the form that she came back in, because she was such a good Christian woman. She was essentially chosen as the first immortal being. And when you look at what the cells can do, they can cure diseases, they can cause problems. If the way they see it is the contamination problem was Henrietta getting back at scientists for hiding things from her family. So, she has the power to, cause problems if you make her mad. She'll cure diseases. So for them, that spiritual realm was a lot of how they understood the cells in the end.
Her daughter Deborah had a breakdown when she discovered that she had a sister she never really knew about called Elsie. What's that story, Rebecca?
So Elsie was Deborah's older sister and the only other daughter in the family. And she was born epileptic and deaf, and she was institutionalized around the time that Henrietta got sick because there were 5 children at that point. Henrietta had a very hard time taking care of Elsie. So she was institutionalized at the recommendation of Henrietta's doctors, and the institution they put her in turned out to, it had recently been called the Home for Crazy Negroes. And
literally, it was called the Home
literally.
for Crazy Negroes?
Yeah, it was. And, being black in the South in the 50s was a very unpleasant thing. Being a Black child in an institution for Black mentally ill patients in the 50s was something that is just sort of unthinkable. I mean, most of the patients there were not actually mentally ill. They were just, it was sort of an umbrella term that they would put over anyone who had epilepsy, if you were deaf, if you had syphilis. They were, adults housed with children, men with women. So there was a lot of, molesting going on. And
I also understand, Rebecca, that some African Americans were imprisoned for being civil rights protesters, because the feeling was that if there was the protest psychosis, as it was called,
right.
If you protested, then you had to be deranged.
And this particular hospital turned out to be one of the worst. And it was the same year Elsie died there when she was 15. And that same year, there was this big investigative story that ran in the newspaper in Baltimore about how overcrowded the hospital was, and that there were, basically patients went in and then they just never came out. They died in there, and that they were all, curable patients. Most of them weren't even sick, and that they were just pretty horrendous things going on in the hospital. And so Deborah didn't know any of that, but she just had this feeling. So she didn't know she had a sister until pretty late in life. And she just, with both her mother and her sister, and I think some of this came from the fact that Deborah was the only girl in her. She was raised around a lot of men who, a lot of them abused her. And she had this feeling of, if my mother and my sister had been here, they would have protected me. That's what women do for each other. And so when she found out about her sister and then also about her mother's cells, she really felt like she needed to protect them. She needed to find out what happened to them. So when I came along and, wanting to write this book, once Deborah finally agreed to talk to me, I said, you can come with me. We'll go into laboratories. You can see your mother's cells for the first time, which we did. And she said, you have to promise me two things. If I talk to you, you're never going to hide anything from me, and you're going to figure out what happened to my mother and my sister, and you're going to tell me. So we would travel together. She would sometimes come with me when I did my research, and we went to the institution where her sister died. And what we found there was beyond anything either of us could have really imagined. There were, we found a photograph of her just absolutely sort of battered with a pair of white hands wrapped around her neck. And we found a lot of these newspaper articles about the hospital at the time. And as we were finding this information, Deborah was sitting next to me. I wasn't in a position where I could have filtered any of this for her or said, are you sure you want to know this? We knew going in that she could find out some traumatic stuff, but we didn't really have any sense of what we were going to find. And the combination of the excitement of seeing her mother's cells for the first time, which we did the day before we went to the hospital, and she actually got to, look at the cells under the microscope and hold them in her hand. And for her, that was the closest she'd ever come to meeting her mother. So there was a lot of emotions tied up in that. And then, the very next day, going to this hospital where we found this information about her sister, she had an absolute breakdown to the point where, it was actually life-threatening. She really, her blood pressure shot up. And it was a pivotal moment for me as a writer in a lot of ways, because I realized, that I had essentially become a character in the story, that I had been another person who came along and put her in this position where suddenly her life was in danger.
Then you witnessed her undergo something that really can only be described as a kind of exorcism.
Yeah, we were in Henrietta's sister's house, which is a slave shack in the same place in Virginia where Henrietta grew up. And Deborah was having this breakdown, and her cousin was this very deeply religious man who, he was one of these people who would just sort of channel the Lord in the middle of a conversation. And he was watching Deborah just sort of spiral, and he just stood up and without warning, he just grabbed her head in his hands and started singing and praying and, yelling, saying, Lord, you've got to take the burden of the cells from this woman. She can't take it anymore. It's going to kill her. And, and I was sitting there in a chair nearby, scribbling notes. I'd never seen anything like this in my life. And he said, Lord, you got to take the burden of these cells. And then he just turned to me and put his hands on either side of my head and said, you've got to give them to her. And his hands are shaking on either side of my head. And, he essentially transferred the cells from Deborah into me.
How was Deborah after this strange ritual?
She was relieved. Yeah, there was absolutely a sense of a burden being lifted for her. And also a transference to me in some senses that, I think part of what was going on is that her cousin really, she was wanting very badly for me to be able to tell the story. And I think there was some element of, him saying, you've got to let her do this. You can't take the burden of all this on yourself. And, it is going to kill you. And you've got to sort of let go of some of this. And she did. It really gave me an entirely new appreciation for the power that faith plays, the power that faith has and the role that it plays in people's lives. It was the first thing that had really ever happened to her that let her just absolutely relax and say, okay, this is okay. I'm going to let this go and try to move on with my life and become okay with the cells before they kill me, basically.
Biotech companies have made millions or billions from the sale of the cells of Henrietta Lacks, the HeLa cells, and it saved millions of lives. Deborah's no longer with us. She died not so long ago, as you write in your book. How are the Lacks family doing health-wise? What kind of help do they get? Or have they had, I should say, up until now?
Yeah, not much has changed for them. I mean, one of the moments in the story in the 70s when the family first found out about the cells, not long after that, they found out that these cells were being bought and sold. And, now anyone can go online and buy a vial of them for about $200, or you can buy products made using them for up to about $10,000 a vial. To this day, her family can't afford health insurance. They sort of live on and sometimes with it, sometimes without it. They struggle, absolutely. Her sons are in their 60s and 70s now, and they have high blood pressure and diabetes and, sort of diseases of inner city impoverished African Americans. And they haven't gotten a lot of help. One of the things, started learning about what happened to the family, I realized that I was essentially in a position to be another person who came along and potentially benefited from these cells in some way without the family getting anything out of it. So I set up a foundation. It's called the Henrietta Lacks Foundation, and some of the proceeds of the book go in there. And my initial hope with it was as a scholarship fund to be able to help descendants of Henrietta Lacks get an education. And I'm hoping that it will become big enough so that other people in need will be able to use it as well. I hope it will help our kids with health insurance. And I've been hoping that there will be, companies out there, biotech companies, who will feel like they can donate to the foundation. That hasn't happened yet.
Rebecca, this is such an amazing story, and I think your book is extraordinary and a kindness as well, as I said. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for being my guest in Conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Rebecca Skloot's book is called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which was made into a film starring Oprah Winfrey. We'll put the details for that on our website, along with the link to the Henrietta Lacks Foundation.
Conversations. 20 years of standout stories.
We've had a lot of fun going through the Conversations archives, reaching right back to the bottom of the cupboard, throwing out the broken coffee cups, the chocolate wrappers, the used tea bags, everything to find some of our oldest and most favourite conversations from the thousands of guests that we've had over the years. This is Helen McDonald. Helen is the author of H is for Hawk, talking about the very start of the training process with her goshawk, Mabel.
So what you do is you start off with in a darkened room that sort of keeps the hawk a little bit less frightened than if you had bright, wide open windows and people going past. And you sit there with a bit of raw meat in your gloved left hand, and you have the hawk sitting on top of it. She's wearing leather straps around her legs called jesses that you hold on to because you don't want her obviously crashing around the room and hurting herself. And then you just wait for the bird to eat. It's all very, very gentle. And, initially the bird is so frightened of you. I remember Mabel, I could hear her blinking, I was trying not to, you don't want to look them in the eyes because that's quite a threatening thing to do. So you're very humble and very quiet, and yet this bird is sitting there and it feels like it's like a sort of, like a flaming torch, it's sort of so full of life. And then one day, eventually the hawk will bend down and start to eat. And that's the first step on that long journey towards absolute trust and a bond between you both. Back in early modern times, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, and also in countries like Pakistan now, you keep the hawk with you all the time in the house. You put a perch on the floor in your front room, you're always around it, and that just gets them used to you very, very, very quickly. But initially, the first few days, there are always a very delicate dance of manners
So you're sitting there in the dark with this hawk, not looking at her.
Yeah.
Is she looking at you?
Yeah, she's staring at you with all the feathers on her head raised in a kind of, what the hell is this? There's enough light for her to see by, And there was an extraordinary moment that day, later on that day, when I was holding her, when she started looking around the room. I was no longer so frightening that she couldn't stop looking at me. And she started looking at kind of the corner of the bookcase and the curtains and a bit of the television. And then she turned back and she saw me and she jumped. She'd forgotten that I was there. And that was a really great moment. It was a moment when I realised that I was not as frightening to her as I had been earlier. So there's this very incremental sense that the bird stops being frightened of you and begins to like you, because every time you see it, you give it food.
And how does she take the meat from your hand the first time? Does she waddle over, or does she fly down to it?
No, she was sitting on my hand. I was really cross, actually. I all this kind of, there's all this sort of hush, this meditative darkness with the bird. But actually, she ate for the first time. I was sitting with her on my fist with holding steak under her toes while watching Hello, the terrible, program on telly with my friend Christina. She'd come round and I thought, what the hell? And the bird started eating and I thought, no, this isn't right, Not while Hello is on. Not while Hello. Sort of, this is a whole, jokes about giant sausages and the occupation of France, and my goshawk starts feeding, and it was all very, 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 very disconcerting. Yeah. So she was always, oddly enough, she was a very, very disconcerting hawk. She wasn't as wild and as frightening, and there was no great battle in her training. She was a complete sweetheart.
What was the scent of the room like with her in it?
Yeah, they had this amazing breath. Oh, God, this sounds so weird, doesn't it? I remember reading once a falconer saying that Lalique should bottle the scent of hawks and put it in sort of little glass jars.
Why? What is it? Can you compare it to anything?
It smells like sort of pepper and musk and kind of burned stone. It's a really weird, sort of feral smell. It's lovely.
And did it impregnate the house? This
no,
scent?
but her poos did, basically. Or as they call them in falconry terminology, mutes. I was basically what happened, I had this huge vinyl tablecloth on the floor. It was green with white spots, and the perch was on it, and I used to have to wipe it all up every morning. Unfortunately, my brother and my sister-in-law bought a new tablecloth a few months ago, which was the same one. And I went round there, and I felt it was very difficult to eat off it, because it was it was the mess tablecloth. So it was a bit awkward, yeah.
HeLa McDonald's book is called H is for Hawk. If you'd like to hear the whole of that conversation, just go to our website. This conversation was recorded in the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. The EP was Pam O'Brien. Executive producer of the Conversation's 20th anniversary collection is Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Fiedler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fiedler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.